Very excited to moderate this second panel on governance issues as we think about questions related to transportation planning and certainly issues related to doing these things in a crisis and responding to this period we now find ourselves in after the fires. It's been an amazing couple weeks in Los Angeles as it relates to this governance question. Just within the last week and a half, on a public meeting that was ostensibly about the rebuilding process, we not only had the local mayor in Karen Bass, we had the governor and the president of the United States, begging the question, at what level should these decisions be made? What are the questions around funding? What are the questions around policy making? And so we have a terrific panel here, in many ways representing several different levels of governance, from the regional down to really the neighborhood and community level, to explore the important questions around governance as we think about many of the decisions that need to be made in the months ahead. So why don't we begin just with some personal introductions, and I'll say as a framing question, talk a little bit about how your lens in the particular level of governance that you're in intersects with these questions around planning and transportation planning. So Anuj, we'll start with you.
Yeah, thanks, Pete. Good afternoon, everybody. It's great to be here, be with all of you. My name is Anuj Gupta. I'm the director of the Department of Transportation for the city of Santa Monica. For those of you who are from out of town, if you just head down either the 10 freeway, one of our big blue bus lines, the Expo line, or a long 15-mile bike ride west and stop right before you hit the ocean, that's us. We are a city of about 95,000 residents, but about 250,000 to 300,000 daytime population between obviously high tourism and a lot of large employers in our city. Being the director of the Department of Transportation, I oversee our municipal regional bus service. The Big Blue Bus serves Santa Monica, but also LAX, UCLA, downtown Los Angeles, Culver City, Mar Vista. In addition to that, our mobility division does all of our multimodal streets design and planning work and our Vision Zero roadway safety work. And then our parking division, which has all of our public parking lots and structures, including our beach lots, also are under our DOT. I've been in that role for about a year and a half. Before that was in the city manager's office as deputy city manager for 6 years in Santa Monica. Previously worked for Mayor Garcetti for a few years, and then a couple different roles in the Obama administration in DC. So I myself have had experience at different levels of government. But I think one of the unique things kind of in response to your question, Pete, is in Santa Monica, we are a relatively small fish in this giant ocean of Los Angeles and the mega region. But I think because of our, historically at least, our resources as a community and as a city government, because of our profile, because of maybe in part our terrain, we're able in some ways to kind of punch above our weight when it comes to transportation, mobility, and other policy, right? Sustainability policy, housing and homelessness, some of the issues we address, the approaches we've brought to them have been things that either have helped kind of fuel a regional or national conversation or model, and also kind of influence regional decision making, which I think is especially something that we have in mind after these last several weeks, right? We were not ultimately directly impacted by the Palisades fire. It came almost just to our northern border. We did have some evacuations in the northern part of our city, but we are heavily involved now in the response. We have a lot of evacuees, residents who've moved temporarily into Santa Monica, businesses, schools that are in Santa Monica. Certainly our transit routes have been affected. We do have a Big Blue Bus line that goes into the heart of the Palisades that we'll talk more about probably in this panel. And I just think, seeing how in Santa Monica, in my experience in transportation and more broadly, right, we try and do what we can and innovate within our sort of small, 8.3 square miles. But we're also trying to be very mindful of how can we actually move the needle with the city of Los Angeles, our very large, big sibling that surrounds us on 3 sides, with the region, with the county, and with all the other 88 cities that make up LA County, and figuring out how do we kind of influence, lead, partner to actually make the kinds of changes we're looking for.
Great. Kurt?
All right, well, good afternoon. My name is Kurt Wilson. So in terms of government, I'm sort of an odd fit in some ways. I wouldn't have sort of pictured myself here because while I'm a big believer in discipline and vision and I'm all in on those, I'm not so big on the rules and constraints for sort of implementing that vision. So it's a bit of an odd thing. So I found my niche by sort of being the crisis guy. So I'm the guy that comes in whenever the agency is in turmoil, there's a state of emergency, oh my goodness, what are we going to do? Bankruptcy or whatever it is. So I'm sort of the guy that gets in there because it gives me the best of both worlds. So I get to sort of play within that structure, but I get to sort of overcome that organizational inertia that we've always done it that way because all bets are off in the middle of a crisis or in the aftermath of trying to figure something out where there's some clear direction you want to go a different way. So I started on the local government side with commissions and all those things and ended up being elected to a city council. In the city of Rialto, about 60 miles or so east of here. So there I am in my 20s, I'm on the council. I considered myself a reasonably intelligent person, had basically zero experience. So I got to be in the room with all these really smart people. So my lens at the time was, what's it gonna do for my little neighborhood? Because my world revolved around my little street. I went to school here, my friend lives here, I did that. So everything was about what made that neighborhood work for me and for my family. Fast forward, I ended up running state agencies under the Schwarzenegger administration. I did a lot of public safety work. And then my lens was different because now my lens was whatever the boss said. So if the priority of the governor was X, then that's what my lens was. And then it was more about how do I convince you to get there? I've got all the money, I've got all the resources, I've got all the regulatory authority, and I've got to try to figure out some way to sort of squeeze you into it. And when you have the purse strings, you have a pretty loud voice. People tend to listen to you. But that was my focus because I didn't care so much whether your city matched what you needed for your child, but more, look, I've got this many millions of people, I've got to get things squared away, am I going to check these boxes and sort of how do we get there? And then the bulk of my career was spent as a city manager. So in managing cities, suddenly I have, instead of one boss, I've got 5 or 7 or whatever the number is in that agency. So the priorities are a little bit different. So I spend a lot more time figuring out sort of how to meet the collective priorities of those different folks. So I spent a little bit more time doing public engagement, basically. Those of you who are familiar with the Davenport Institute or have gone to any of their trainings know there's a heavy focus on public engagement, not public communication and not sort of the one-way telling you things, but actually getting deep in there and figuring things out with that much richer conversation. And I found myself doing that because yes, I sort of can pull the purse strings and control those sorts of things, but in the long run, I've got some very key stakeholders that I've got to get squared away. And now I work for a council of governments, so I've got 18 cities and a county and water and a whole bunch of other public agencies all looped in together. So on one hand, yes, I still have the purse strings, so people will tend to listen, but because the needs of each one of those communities is so different, I spend more of my time trying to sort of figure out whether it's the common ground or whatever's going to work to sort of move the needle, something that gets us off of the territorial piece. And that's analogous here because you're talking about rebuilding a community, and at some point that's going to come to, well, how are we going to rebuild it? Was it working for me before? Was it not working for me before? That's going to change whether or not I'm inclined to want to see it the same or see it different. And somebody is going to have to sort of navigate all of those different roles. So many of the people in this room are the ones who are going to be at the table figuring out what goes forward. So I'm the happy guy who's not in the region and not having to deal with anything to do with this particular issue.
Or
Great, I'm Norm Benning-Petersman. I'm the Director of Movement Building for Strong Towns, which is a 501c3 advocacy organization with members now all across Canada, the United States, but also in other parts of the world. And my role in movement building is to build a movement of advocates that are willing to accept that the development pattern that we see across North America is breaking our cities. It's making them weak and fragile. And so in 5 simple words, we seek to change that is the core of our mission. So we're trying to replace the suburban development pattern with a pattern of development that is financially strong and resilient. And this is all with the purpose then of making our places safe, livable, and inviting. But a key element, if you've come across any Strong Towns content, we sometimes have people that come across Strong Towns content on cycling, for example, and they think we're just about cycling. But actually, at its core is, in order for our places to become more safe, livable, and inviting, they actually have to have this financial resiliency, this financial core or financial performance to them that's really essential. And so we are building a movement consisting of 3 main audiences that we seek to reach: elected officials, technical professionals, and concerned citizens. And especially with a third audience, this is where I think in part the discussion will go in our time that I can share is, we have now over 260 local conversation groups, which are groups that just popped up in various places, led by keen individuals that have said, hey, most of them are, I chatted with an ice cream parlor owner in Colombia, down in South America, a bus maintenance mechanic in Georgia, just folks that are regular folks, and they say, I'm interested, I want to know, how do I lead a conversation about these issues in my community? And then, influenced by Strong Towns principles and ideas, seek to put these things into action where I live. And so what's awesome is 260 groups are actively meeting, and they have websites and Instagram and all of that sort of stuff. But there's another 1,300 places where other individuals, about a pool of 2,500 people, have stepped forward saying, we want to get a group going in our community as well. Primarily in North America, but if you look at, we're going to release the map in a moment here, or in our State of Strong Towns report, where we have folks in Pakistan and Romania and the Netherlands, in Japan, in South Africa, that are in South America, throughout most of the many major cities there, all saying we also have brought many sort of American-inspired ideals of what the ideal life and development pattern looks like, but it's actually financially ruinous for many of our communities. And so perhaps you've come across the work of Chuck Marone, who's the president and founder of Strong Towns. He has written the book, Confessions of a Recovering Engineer, on the question of how to bring reform to the transportation engineering profession to really account for the carnage on our streets when it comes to the number of lives that are lost in ways that we would not accept if it was not happening on our roadways. And tied into that, my own personal experience, just to highlight that a little bit, I've been with Strong Towns for 2.5 years doing this work. Prior to that, I was actually a pastor for 10 years. And as a pastor, you really get to understand that many people are just content to be left alone, kind of want to just live in a neighborhood, but were struggling with loneliness, struggling because they didn't know their neighbors. And it wasn't because they were bad people, it wasn't because they were lazy, but it was in part because of the way that their entire neighborhood had been constructed to in many ways keep them from really engaging deeply with their neighbors. That initial question of what's wrong with people put Strong Towns on my radar, which asks the question, what's wrong with our built environment? And so that's the perspective that I'm able to bring. Before this, I did work in local politics, writing letters that I now wish I could retract from the mayor's office, as well as at the federal level, issuing approvals as part of the team, issuing approvals of budget-ready or shovel-ready projects in 2008 during the financial crisis, which Chuck Marone would say, a shovel-ready project is just a project that local government said, we are definitely not paying for this ourselves, but maybe we'll find a sucker somewhere else. And so that was the work that I was doing at the federal level, and that is perhaps part of the decision-making process that I'm shading in a certain direction, but I think is an important element of this when money is at the ready to be poured out in spigots, and yet the question is, will this become just a cataclysmic infusion of cash that so disrupts the local economy to really change things in a significant way?
Well, that's a perfect segue to the first question. A phrase that we are hearing more and more by public officials, policymakers at all levels, is the desire to cut red tape, whether it's from the governor or the mayor or the president or community leaders. But when you step back, red tape is just public policy, right? It was created by people. It may have been influenced by special interest. It may have good reasons, may have bad reasons, but it is nonetheless created out of either an administrative or a legislative process. As we think about some of the rebuilding challenges in front of us, and we're hearing public officials talking about the cutting of red tape, one of the questions that goes begging is, are we once again just responding to this crisis, or are there things that we, dare I say, in taking advantage of this crisis, could see longer-term policy change couched under this rubric of cutting red tape that really should be a longer-term policy regime going forward? So, question just to send down the line, what are the red tape cutting measures that you've heard that you think are not only very important to consider in the short term in responding to this crisis as it relates to planning and transportation? And what are then the related issues that you could see? I hope that this becomes an opportunity to look at these regulations in a different way going forward. Anuj.
Yeah, it's a very relevant question. I think there was kind of an eruption last week here with Los Angeles County passing an emergency motion with regard to rebuilding. That I think the goal, the objective was to kind of minimize, cut red tape or minimize obstacles, minimize the impact of state mandates or state policies in order to enable people to rebuild quickly and move back in quickly. But I think, as folks dug deeper, and I think probably some of the advocates in this room, right, it became clear that this was also potentially about, circumventing some state policies that have been put in place in order to actually address housing crisis, climate crisis, transportation crisis that arguably, or maybe not arguably, got us in this disaster in the first place, right, or at least exacerbated it in terms of the severity of these fires, the severity of the natural disasters that we're seeing. And so I think that was a really interesting debate that, in ostensibly wanting to cut red tape, get people moved back more quickly, rebuild these devastated neighborhoods more quickly, was it also, potentially going backwards in terms of where, the state wants to be headed, where we need to be headed in terms of, planning, land use, transportation, densification potentially. And so I think, it's these two particular neighborhoods, being now in Santa Monica, and then I actually grew up in the San Gabriel Valley, very close to Altadena, so I'm very familiar with how special both Altadena and the Palisades are, and they are special and prized in part, because they have been historically, largely, not entirely, but largely single-family neighborhoods with beautiful homes, beautiful lots, beautiful kind of landscape surrounding them. But I think, in this moment of rebuilding, in this moment where, so tragically they were almost wiped clean, I think it's absolutely incumbent on us to think, not necessarily and not remotely about building high rises, throughout either of those neighborhoods, but at least thinking differently about how people live there, how people move around there, and how in that rebuilding we can actually start to address some of the root causes that may have got us here, right? So I think, whether it's when it comes to housing, when it comes to transportation and mobility, right? As I said, we have at Big Blue Bus in Santa Monica, we have a very well-served line, our Route 9 that goes into the Pacific Palisades. But primarily, the ridership of that line consists of two populations, neither of whom live in the Pacific Palisades. It's students who go to the excellent Palisades Charter High School that was at least partially damaged in the fires, but permit in from throughout Los Angeles. They take rail to get to the Santa Monica station, Expo Line station, and then take our bus to get up to school. And then it's a high population of domestic workers who, again, commute from throughout the LA region, often by bus or rail, and then take our Route 9 service to work at the homes in the Palisades, right? Of course, there are some Palisades residents, some seniors who come out of the Palisades into Santa Monica to shop and whatnot, but primarily it's folks who aren't living there. And so how do we think about perhaps redesigning that neighborhood or Altadena and the infrastructure to actually make it a community where the residents take advantage of transit, take advantage of bike infrastructure, right? Are traveling differently. And the other quick example I'll cite is PCH, right? And I know it's the Pepperdine conference, so I don't want to touch any third rails with PCH here.
So to speak.
Yeah, but at the same time, right, it was just so interesting to see after this almost month of closure, PCH reopening on Sunday with these restrictions, one lane of traffic in each direction, 25 miles per hour speed limit, all traffic signals are going to be flashing red, so basically always stops, and heavy enforcement presence for anyone breaking any of those rules.
Yep.
And there were plenty of people within our department who thought, wow, these are revolutionary ideas. What if, right? What if that was PCH, right? Where you reallocated space for a transit and bicycle lane or transit bike and first responder lane, and you slowed down the speed limits. You changed the traffic signal infrastructure so it wasn't actually a vehicle highway, but was a place to actually move more people and move them in more sustainably and safely, because another crisis on PCH before the fires was the rash of deaths, including the very tragic deaths of the Pepperdine students a couple of years ago. So how do we kind of rebalance in that way? I do think as we do rebuild and think about how we do things differently, these are some opportunities that we can look to.
I've taken 2 round trips on PCH in the last 3 days, and it does, first off, it is overwhelming, the level of destruction. Not even going into the Palisades, but just seeing what was there, what is there is jaw-dropping. But it does make you think about it's organized or regulated now exactly as you say. It's 25, 30 miles an hour. It's all blinking red lights at each one of the intersections. It's what used to be a 35-minute trip from campus to Santa Monica is now a 50 to 55-minute trip, but it's still the fastest way to get between those 2 points, even with those restrictions and regulations in place. So it does make you wonder if there will be those considerations. And you're absolutely right to say that prior to the fires, the major concern that many had in Malibu and up and down Coast Highway was the number of traffic fatalities. And to see it in a way that it's still the quickest way to get between those 2 points, but it may be 20 minutes longer, it puts some of the trade-offs in a different context for sure. Kurt, your thoughts, you're obviously leading a regional government, and one of the questions about the levels of government I think that's being raised is what role do or should regions have in this? As LA and this region looks to rebuild, do you have any thoughts as to how the regions might play a role here beyond the cities but short of the counties?
Yeah, so in my case, so my focus is, regional government basically does things that make sense either because of an economy of scale or some technical expertise or some sort of political convenience where it makes sense for somebody else to do that. Transportation is one of those things. So nobody really argues that transportation has a regional impact, so we do a bunch of things. We collect money, we build, we do all that stuff that crosses borders, because you can't really build a great road just within your city. You're going to have to sort of cross it and go through those things. So resource-wise, there's a whole lot more resources from that bigger piece that you can sort of put into the issue. But quality of life-wise, so we've got 483 cities in California. People choose a city, other than because my mom lives there or my job is there. They choose it because this has the stuff that I like. Maybe I like the water, the mountain, the shop, the arts, whatever it is. I get to pick among all those different places to have that. So the good part about the regional government, or in this case, even the state government sort of coming in, is it brings an influx of resources that make a whole lot of sense. Very efficient, you can really get there. The flip side is that we actually want our communities to be different. We want people to have a city that sort of matches up with, aligns with whatever their wants and desires are. It's difficult to do that from the 30,000 foot level. That's best done from that ground up level. So it's really sort of a combination of the two, because setting the targets, I think, should be done from the folks on the ground, the folks who are not just interested parties who are gonna, this is fun, I want to be in this for the next few months and then I'm off to something else, but set by the people who live it, have some skin in the game, and then through that partnership, resourced by the other stuff. Cutting that red tape, cutting red tape, if that red tape was the result of legitimate policy making, yes, there are some long-term impacts that's going to conflict with whatever the policy objective was when you're going through that whole piece. But the practical reality is you got to get through today before you can get to tomorrow sometimes. And in that case, in the middle of an emergency, sometimes you have to make some tweaks and do all those. And then there's sort of the difficult policy position of, okay, you suspended this rule today and we got the good result, we got back on track, so why not just leave it suspended? And that opens up a new policy debate, and there's some political pressures that come along with that are difficult. But I think the combination of that regional or state or some sort of bigger level of government, I think there's a clear role, resource, expertise, economy of scale, all those sorts of things, but unless the targets are selected by the folks who were actually impacted, you get a mediocre result.
Norm, I wanted to come to you in thinking about what is the role of residents and communities in this as well. And I just wanted to frame the conversation or the question. There was a great piece in the LA Times by Bill Deverell he's emeritus at USC, and I know he's a colleague of Wade Graham's who's going to be closing us here at the end of the conference. He had a great piece about a week ago. Southern California's past can play a role in rebuilding for the future. I just wanted to read one short paragraph and get your reflections. Repair and replace roads and water lines, yes. Fill the reservoirs. Fix the energy and communication networks. Help people construct a lasting shelter, but also reweave our singed civic fabric, the places of daily life that make a vast city meaningful and manageable. Businesses, public parks, houses of worship, schools, libraries. Part of the rebuilding task must include marking and remembering, trying to retie threads that connect us to history and place. Now, it seems to me that is a tough role for government to do. But I also think that, frankly, we should be encouraging government to think along those lines. But as it relates to residents, I know that there's increasing fear as I hear the debates around the rebuilding that these regions are going to be taken over by developers. And it's going to be developers and the government and those things. That's where these questions are going to be solved. Talk a bit about your experience with communities and giving a voice to them and how they can best engage in these processes.
Yeah, I'm going to think on that singed civic fabric line. That's a turn of phrase that I'll think about for a while. A key element of it is addressing the role of the individual as being empowered to place make. I love that language of marking and remembering. And elements of that is that's what we naturally seek to do as individuals. It's actually something often that cities are quite poor at. How, despite Roman Mars's admonitions on 99% invisible, I often don't read the plaques because they're extremely boring. They recognize something without any additional context. And so you're looking for those core gems. And I think that's where our local groups are, one example of these types of civic groups that can be so valuable, where one of the treasured pastimes is going out for neighborhood walks. And one of the elements of going out for a neighborhood walk, I always encourage our group leaders, make sure you hit up a Strode-like environment before you get back to maybe the more tranquil sort of mixed-use neighborhood or missing middle neighborhood, in order to experience what that area where you very viscerally feel that you are unsafe, unwelcome, and undignified versus the places where you feel particularly welcome. Even encouraging cities to help, with citizens' input, map the areas where you feel welcome and dignified. And that will vary by individuals, but actually encouraging groups to say, in our neighborhood, we, for instance, in my city that I grew up in, Google suddenly was dropping in neighborhood names that had we were befuddled. Where did those names come from? And it was so citizen pushback meant that people were pushing back and going and contacting them and saying, hey, that's not what it's called. It's never been called that. It's named after this. It was always, whatever the old school with an old man's name on it was, they were just assigning that as the neighborhood name when it lacked that local context. And this can be where the layer of decision making is also at the lot by lot basis. Property owners often, the vast majority of our housing lands are owned by individuals, either themselves or in landlord-tenancy relationship. And at Strong Towns, we talk about one of the key regulatory reforms that we need on housing, but this will have an effect on neighborhoods as well, is we need to allow every neighborhood to move to the next increment of development by right. And that is just different than the current process of go and bow and genuflect and go through this, or as in the province of BC now, for example, or California has done this, where all of a sudden a new threshold is established, and so you can build up to that level. And so that is helping, despite many local governments' efforts to sort of get in the way of that. But what is necessary is actually to recognize there's a cycle of investment that is needs to be happening, not just in this decade where we assign a new cap or a new floor, but actually over time. And then we also insist, if you want to maintain your current sort of zoning and bowing and genuflecting before the commission sort of process, allow that if you need to skip multiple increments of development. But what would happen from the perspective of the locals is that many of the projects that is, Frank doing work in his backyard and making it a duplex would be accepted and embraced because it's just by right. In the same way that if Roger went and got a new truck, nobody gets to weigh in on it. So allowing that process to step in. Another key part of it is the consolidating of many of the use restrictions. My municipality, I think we have 24 different use cases for residential, including residents with a coach house or residents with an ADU. It's madness when it should all just be low density residential. So we definitely advocate for zoning reform. And where we're seeing that take hold is when city leaders are able to get from residents stories of loss, stories of deprivation. I wanted to move my mother-in-law into my backyard, but she didn't want to live in the playhouse. We needed to build her a structure, but we were prevented from doing so because of a 2-foot setback problem. Well, that should be a situation that then triggers modest sort of incremental reform of the zoning bylaws. The city of Vancouver, for example, I think has 860 and counting distinct zoning categories, which are the bespoke categories for, well, that project is the one we want to see, so we'll just give a comprehensive development permit to it. That's the process that says you've got a huge problem, that you've over-restricted all of the layers by which you could normally pass through. None of the pathways apply, and so there's this yearning, well, we've got to figure out a way to hack this. The trouble with each one of those comprehensive development zones, or there's different PUDs, I think is commonplace here, is you have to go and negotiate. There's a horse trade going on. That just adds to the cost of what it'll cost the individual. It just adds to the frustration. If someone sees the development sign go up, they have to fret and worry about what's going to happen for years, rather than just in the process realizing, oh, it's not as big as I thought it was. When it's in the framing stage, it looks bigger than when it's actually built. And this is one of the insights I think we can share often is people will not be so opposed to the thing that was built 5 years ago, but the thing built 5 years from now, certainly they are. And that is another key element. And then just one more encouragement as well is the removal of parking requirements. Parking requirements are one of those areas where there's always going to be a market requirement on a lot-by-lot basis. But the idea that the municipally imposed requirements should supersede any kind of market requirement, which again is an argument against parking maximums as much as parking minimums, is actually it's removing the ability at the local level to say, hey, at this block, how are we going to figure this out? And if the nuisance is that somebody else is using the publicly available street, now all of a sudden you have a bit more desire to say, either I start using my garage for the vehicle that I intended it to be in and not for my pool table or my other stuff, or we actually put a price on parking. And so some of those shifts are going to be necessary, and people can lead that level at the local, at a neighborhood by neighborhood level.
I've had some conversations at the break with a few of you, and it's prompted a question that I hadn't frankly planned on asking, so you can forget our prep call that we had in getting ready for this discussion. And I guess maybe if I were to group those conversations under one rubric, it would be how much change really has to happen around these issues related to planning, transportation, and mobility. Is this, are we looking at a moment here certainly triggered by the fires, but there are a lot of other things going on in the public policy and political environment right now that seems to be opening or causing people to ask bigger questions about governance reform. And so, Anuj, I want to come to you, and I certainly don't want to get you in trouble, so you'll navigate this, as I'm sure you will. The governor of the state has called for, in his own inimitable way of framing and marketing things, it's time for Los Angeles 2.0. When asked what that actually means, he really didn't have anything to back it up. But it is a way of conceiving, I think, in ways that I think the governor does very well, to think about what scope or level of change could happen here. He has called for the California Coastal Commission to essentially cease and desist. He has called for significant CEQA reforms, and obviously these other areas that fall under the general bucket of red tape. How big of an opportunity, as someone who works at the city level, do you see what's coming in this rebuilding process? And it could be for better or for worse, in either reforming or changing the roles of these major, at one time considered reforms, like CEQA, like the Coastal Commission?
Yeah, I mean, it's a must, I think, from our perspective as a city, and I think just from our community's perspective. I think this ties back to what was referenced at the end of the last panel, is, simply rebuilding the faith in the ability of governments in the state, in this region, to get things done, to complete projects within some reasonable scope of time, right? And I think all of the obstacles that have been put in place, all of the steps, all of the restrictions, right? And this is California, and they're largely typically put in place for very laudable reasons that the vast majority of our cities, the vast majority of our residents would support when it comes to the broader objective: sustainability, access, public process and transparency, right? But it really is, if there is not a rethinking of those requirements through this crisis and through the need to rebuild, through the need to prepare for the Olympics in three plus years, then it will be a massive failure. So I think one of the things you mentioned, for example, is the Coastal Commission, and I don't know if we have any commission staff or members here, but it's a source of frustration long before the fires for us in the city of Santa Monica, for almost anything that we want to do within the coastal zone. Not only is the need to go through the coastal process and obtain a coastal development permit, but once you dig in and the back and forth, that interplay, the purpose, right, is to preserve coastal access, which we can all get behind. No one's going to disagree with that. That everybody in this state, people of all backgrounds, should have access to this amazing jewel of a resource that we have. But so often it ends up playing out as coastal access equals parking. And especially for a city like Santa Monica, and frankly for a region like ours, where we have alternatives, where we have so many different ways to get to the coast. And coastal access can mean, which we now have, a light rail line that basically takes you directly to Santa Monica Beach and the pier, where we have multiple bus routes, where we have increasingly safe, protected bicycle infrastructure that feeds directly towards our beach. How can we rethink what coastal access means and make the argument, and then eliminate some of those requirements? I'm not saying necessarily blow up the commission or the entire process, but really rethink it in a way that we are able to prove that we provide sufficient coastal access, and then we can actually make improvements, do new things, whether it's permit new housing, rethink our public right-of-way, all sorts of things that currently are just way too difficult and time-consuming, and as the earlier panel said, really erode the faith of residents of the state that anything can get built to improve their communities or improve their lives.
Anuj, I think you put your finger on something, and it speaks to the moment that I hope we don't let not only go by us, but actually to exacerbate the problem, and that's our ability to recover from this. Because you're absolutely right to say the levels of distrust in governing institutions as we all know, Gallup does their annual survey on trust in different levels of governing institution. And for many years, certainly since Watergate and the 70s, we've seen levels of trust in federal government drop precipitously. But it was always the case that our state and local governments had an inverse response to that. But even since COVID, that has been changing significantly. And I hope it is understood that how we respond to this and how creatively we think or don't think, how we revisit some of these third rails, which is a term, thankfully, we're using a lot in this conference. I think we need to have another conference just talking about all the third rails we have to grab onto. But if we don't, there stands an opportunity to make these levels of trust even lower.
Absolutely.
Because this really is a time that demands creative, far-sighted, courageous leadership. And I know that you're doing that in Santa Monica. Kurt, you've worked as a city manager, but you've also worked at the regional level. What do you think, you kind of touched on this before, but I'd like to go a little bit deeper into what are the advantages and disadvantages of each level of governance, the local level versus the regional level? Now that you're heading up a COG, what are the things that you see there as you oversee how many cities are in the Western Riverside COG?
18.
18. So as you get that more of a regional view, what are the things that you think that there's advantage to thinking about things in a regional level as opposed to local?
So the goalposts move depending on your vantage point. So when you're at the city level, all these decisions have a political bent to them. All public policy sort of has that, and that's driven by certain factors or people or issues, something that sort of pushes some buttons for you. At the local level, it's easier to figure out what those are. Sometimes it's a bad actor who is prominent in the community or in the workforce or something. Whether or not you like it, you know good and well, hey, I can't do so-and-so because that developer's not going to go for it, or that so-and-so's not going to go for it. Easy to define what they are. So the goalposts are there, like them or not. As you work your way out and as that view changes, so in City A, it's a different set of issues than it is in City B or in City C. But resource-wise, you've got to find some sort of a consensus among all these different folks. So it's a little bit more of a puzzle piece that goes along with it. And you end up in a spot where when you take off your sort of local hat and you put on your regional hat, if you can find something that is some sort of a North Star that you're trying to work toward, there's a path to get there, but you don't have the luxury of just saying, hey, you got to stay away from such and such because the third rail in this community is not the same as the third rail in this other community. So it's much more ambiguous in terms of just trying to find your way around and figure out where the landmines are. So you spend a lot more time trying to understand the game because it's no longer sort of given to you quite as clean. But if you can, best case scenario, figure out what they are, you can move forward, or at least worst case scenario, figure out the worst of them to sort of run away from. But you can end up being this catalyst if you can, I find myself in a spot where I'm familiar with this city, where the county is, the so-and-so. So in my mind, I can sometimes envision a lane that they can't because they have to spend all of their energy into that one lens.
Right.
So if I'm able to do that, that's sort of my contribution. So, we've got a team of folks who's out there and doing all that stuff. And then you end up being sort of a catalyst toward hopefully getting something good done.
We're going to come to questions here in a second, but Norm, I wanted to come to you. One of the things we discussed on our prep call as Anuj was mentioning the single big blue bus line that runs into the Palisades and the thought of the possibility of growing the presence of transit in those places, whether it's Altadena or in the Palisades. You talked about one of the processes that you've used to help the public think about possible transit options and the walkability before the transit piece. And I think that's one of the questions that people have too, is that how much of a trade-off are we looking at? How different are things going to be? I think that's really, at least my perception of many of the public debates that are happening right now, is they're being generated out of fear, fear of the unknown, and then leaping to places where they believe that it's the city or community or neighborhood that they knew is going to change radically. But talk about some of the importance of understanding the steps along the way, no pun intended, between and connecting walkability and transit.
Well, I think this is the element of making sure that your walk shed actually it becomes the priority of many of the types of initiatives that you work at in terms of just the local streetscape improvements. And this is part of the challenge that local governments have, is that they struggle to be able to justify the priorities that they set, because they don't want those priorities to be seen as prejudicial or favoring a particular group. And this is where a connection of street improvements, making sidewalks more suitable or bringing them in where they belong, within a certain radius of any given transit stop is a way to signal to the regional government. In our case, it's TransLink, the regional metro transit provider, signaling we are setting the stage for walking in this neighborhood to be much more commonplace. And so that looks like taking a quick look at the property maps and saying, hey, we could probably convince one of those homeowners to allow pass-through. All of a sudden now we reduce that distance that somebody would need to get to, even to a planned stop, let alone to one that is already existing, where that blue line is already running, and those types of things are taking place. And then asking, as part of that process, working with individuals to say, within this walk shed, you should expect some change, and it will be to your benefit. It will look like, Nolan mentioned, accessory commercial units. There's opportunities for communities to become a lot more fluid about the types of permissions that they offer in terms of the zoning structure. You can write in addition to residences, there can be conversion to office, to professional services, and to low square footage retail. There are ways to do that, and then you have to contend with the building code. So if somebody says, hey, that front yard thing, somebody was living in it, and now we've converted it into a hair salon, yeah, you're gonna have to get the electrical up to code. But you can do that, and then if the business fails, that it can actually be converted back. We saw this with form-based code places where they say residences are needed. It's got to be, second, third floor, fourth floor residence, and then retail on the bottom. And they have such a prescriptive view of what that retail will be, but it actually belies the development math. Just doesn't work for that upfront investment to be into retail. They say we can't get tenants. So then they say we reject the form-based code idea. But if you allow for this temporary to be used for residents, but with the option for it to become those other things, then each of your transit stops can become, and again, not by heavy-handed saying now that lot, without any recourse to the property owner, becomes it, but within a radius, you suddenly create a thing to walk to, a thing to ride a bus to, or a way to get back from it. And we see this in all of our historic downtowns and commercial sort of village centers. The doctor's office in the old house, that was just the retail or commercial zone creeping in as needs emerged based on proximity and value. And that is something that residents are actually really good at identifying. And then at the regional level, we see this, TransLink is doing a better job with this in Vancouver, is they are saying, my city, the 601 bus route is really important to us. It is the 49th busiest bus route in the Lower Mainland, which means it's way down the rank in terms of priority. So they have said to the city, you will get improvement only if and when we begin to see ridership numbers improve. How do you do that? You change your land use practices. And then the last element of it is for regional governments to actually be in the game, especially in situations right now where properties have been raised, where there are going to be people open to selling the property that they have, for regional authorities to say, we will purchase in the vicinity of where we plan to do improvements of the transit. And so in some places in Vancouver, the BC government had to actually changed their own rules to allow the transit agency to be a purchaser of properties, which then that fuels the new investment in tracks and rail and in stations and those types of things. The Japanese have been doing this for ages. We have let that tool sit on the side and we say, we pay for tracks, we pay for stations, we pay for none of this. We see none of the benefit of the land lift, any of the benefit for the regional body that is working on transit. All the local benefit is felt, and it only later trickles up. So that's that whole pendulum, that the local perspective is where a lot of decision making can be returned, but we need the regional and then even higher levels of government at the level of their sort of broad purview to really be engaged in that process. But if it starts with, how do we create a lot more productive use of that stop? It means, for one, you're not going to let it be a hell zone. So you're going to make sure it's buffered from speeding cars. We have a contest, the worst bus stop in British Columbia. It's egregious, and we do this to ourselves, and we don't have to, with very little money. And so many of our local conversation groups, I'll end on this, I think we have 8 local conversation groups right now that meet up regularly, build benches, and go set them at bus stops. They're like, it's lacking. We can do it with the resources that we have. In the city of Charlotte, they realized we've been underinvesting in benches and we're being shown up by a bunch of punks. Let's actually buy some more benches. And now they're making a commitment. We are going and installing benches for people. Elderly, children need benches. That's one way to keep a child in place so they're not running onto the road. Sit on that bench. I've had to do that myself. And we need that level of granularity, and it's not that far out of reach.
Let's open it up for questions. We have questions. Yes, Clark.
Because it's the last thing you said that's stuck. The first question is,
What's up?
is it working? Okay. First question is, what do you think is going to happen when that same city mandates benches at bus stops? And I'm asking this in the context of the story of recycling in Seattle, for instance, which is a really good essay, and I'm trying to remember the reference on that. Right, and this relates to another embedded question is, are we missing a scale of governance or policy making down here because our county is bigger than Greece, right? And also thinking about CEQA and coastal, somehow a mediating institution, I learned that here at Pepperdine, was created that started being about putting benches at bus stops. And they're probably beautiful, they're handmade, and they're like, and they probably didn't ask permission. They probably didn't go through a process for asking for that bench. In terms of CEQA and coastal, I think it's really interesting that the governor can say, we're gonna just, no CEQA mandate anywhere, we're dissolving that. What does that really mean? He's kicking the review back down. He's being a localist, right? It's got to go to the local level because Malibu, look where all the homes are lost. Malibu, the county. I'm not sure about City of LA. I don't know a lot of City of LA work, what their coastal process is, but it doesn't go away. It just got kicked downstairs. What you lost in that is like, sorry, if you got a problem with your local government, you can't appeal it to the state level to say they were wrong. So anyway, that's just one example of, and so I'm wondering, is Malibu too big to make land use decisions in the midst of a disaster? I'm using the smallest jurisdiction to hear. Should it be smaller? I don't know. Just it's that subsidiary thing. Like, are we missing something here? Is that what's wrong with CEQA? Is because there's nothing in between, or?
So the issue of statewide mandates is one that, from a strong towns perspective, we would certainly insist that if there needs to be a statewide mandate for something, it ought to be proscriptive, not prescriptive. Many of our prescriptive standards, there are Americans with Disabilities Act and others that have an important role to play. But many of the other sort of design standards or elements like this, especially as we see them applied in the suburbs, are designed to be resistant to change, exclude by class, and assume auto-dependency. And if those are the standards that are being applied, then sort of other sort of band-aids that are added to it, often through statewide mandates, are really challenging. This is where a mandate that says you can no longer restrict housing lands so that only single detached dwellings can be built there makes sense. Sometimes you need to come in with a bulldozer and move it so that way the advantage that one city might gain over another by never removing their rigid requirements might be lifted. But then there's also, I think, around local government reform, certainly there are more and more places that are saying we need a neighborhood planning unit that is connected to the neighborhood public works and that is connected to the neighborhood bylaw enforcement. And they basically meet and their general manager reports directly to the city manager. And all of the subsidiary sort of departments, they're not sort of, and reorganization of local government is everybody's favorite hobby, but there's an element of insight to what you're talking about that on a neighborhood by neighborhood level, then you can also begin to experiment with, say, 100 different experiments, maybe not 100, but say 25 different experiments. Oh, they started doing this. Yeah, we should do that. That's a really good idea. Otherwise, good ideas never get implemented. And this could be or it takes so long to be implemented that the original visionary behind it sort of dwindles away. Making the good visible before it's permanent, enshrined, is something that's really important as well. Make it visible before you make it permanent is another key principle that we would hold to. So, and that calls for experimentation rather than sort of strict, let's get it right, heaven forbid we make the smallest mistakes, even though we're willing to entertain really, really big ones, like the big bets that Mr. Florida was describing.
Any other thoughts on that? Other questions?
I'm going to ask the opposite of your question, I think, which is that, LA County has 88 cities. We've got like 200 special districts. We've got 9 COGs. We've got 13 city council districts, 5. We got a lot of subsidiary governmental representation, it seems to me. And, a lot of people, obviously, I think during the fires, were saying, like, where's the leadership, right? Like, and people were blaming Karen Bass for things, but Karen Bass doesn't represent Altadena, nor does she represent parts of Santa Monica that were affected, right? Or Malibu.
Right.
And obviously, the fires are happening in light of the Olympics, which are 4 years away, or 3 years away. And I think similar questions are being raised, right? Like, who is in charge here, given that this is, doesn't matter which city or COG you're in, like, the Olympics are going to impact you. So I'm curious if you have ideas for, like I said, the opposite of your question, like consolidation or accountability, countywide, regionally, right? There's SCAG, but I work in planning. I'm not totally sure what SCAG does. I'm curious about any ideas on that end.
I think you put your finger on something, that we wrestle with certainly all the time in the context of, disasters and crises, also in the context of kind of longer range planning efforts like the Olympics. That sense of, on the one hand, I think all these different layers of government or municipalities tend to want to first and foremost figure out their own stuff, right? And I think we're in Santa Monica, we're facing this with the Olympics. On the one hand, it's unresolved still as to whether or not we're going to be a host city. There's still some discussions going on for beach volleyball, but regardless, right, for my department and my team, the question of transit and transportation in the region is going to be extremely relevant, regardless of whether or not we have, an event in Santa Monica, because we know that people will be moving in and through the west side, through Santa Monica, from LAX. And yet, there's all these agencies that we're on these, calls every month or so, and there's, similar sort of slide presentations that go through, and we have large agencies, municipal agencies like ours, all kind of working together, identifying the same challenges, and not necessarily progressing towards solutions because of that lack of sort of central leadership, central resources, right? And often the answers have been in the last couple of years, we're waiting for and hoping for some federal infusion of cash, federal grant, right, to solve all our problems, buy all of our buses, or enable us to design all these mobility hubs or whatever the idea may be. I think that hope has subsided substantially, right, for the time being. And so I think it does become a challenge, at least on the government side, of at a certain point, right, and some of our staff in Santa Monica are focused on, okay, we will certainly stay at this table and be engaged in these conversations, but we've got a plan to make sure that at least in Santa Monica, the visitor experience is safe, the transit experience is as seamless and engaging as possible. And it's not necessarily a positive answer, right? If everybody just balkanizes and figures out, protecting their own, but in the absence of really strong structures for leadership and coordination, that is, what we risk. And I think every event or panel you go to with regard to the Olympics, there's that same kind of palpable anxiety as the days keep ripping off the calendar, getting closer, and we don't necessarily have all the answers we need to those questions.
And I'd add that, so the leadership piece for me is a little different than the title. So you mentioned some of the agencies, the 88 cities, we have all these different things. Each one of them has their own mandate and structure and people, and they do all that stuff. When things are going well and everything is just sort of status quo, those all work. But in the middle of a crisis, if we all represent different things, I can do my job well based on what's written down, he can do his, and we still sort of blow it. The public doesn't care that we can sort of navigate the bureaucracy and say, well, on page 12B, it says that I did so-and-so and I did it, I checked the box. They just sort of want the result piece, and the leadership is really sort of what rises above that. So it's not necessarily tied to that title or to that, whatever it is. It's really this confluence of, there's a charisma component, because you've got to sort of convince people to come along and do things even when you don't have that authority. And that's the difference with leadership is whoever's sort of running this train may not on paper have something that says, hey, I can tell so-and-so what to do, but they can still do it because you have to sort of rise above. And I think, it'll be interesting to see how that plays out, but there are a number of folks who have the charisma, the access to the technical expertise, the desire, the commitment to get things done, and somewhere among that group, somebody will end up taking the reins. But you can't just sort of self-identify. It's the folks who sort of have that that critical mass say yes, so and so is the one. I'm with that person, and political figures are usually the ones who rise to that occasion. But you've got a lot of strong folks to choose from. But I don't think it's going to be based on whichever title.
It was CAL FIRE.
Yeah.
Just to answer that question during the crisis, it was probably CAL FIRE 3 days too long. So, and then because that's the small L that was functioning, the big L that you were talking about, just living in Topanga and watching these crews and everything that happened pre and post fire, it was CAL FIRE, and they were really good in active firefront conditions. But yeah,
nobody elected CAL FIRE, so that's a crisis situation, right?
Well,
Just ever so briefly, as an assurance, I was in the mayor's office in the city of Surrey, which was a host city for the 2010 Olympics. We had the same problems in Metro Vancouver, and the games turned it out wonderfully. So I hope the same for Los Angeles. Just assured, and it is amazing to see how that stuff all of a sudden pulls together, kind of in crunch time, with a significant provincial bailout. So maybe that's in the works as well.
love that little footnote. Please join me in thanking our panel. Also, just wanted to note, Kurt brought it up, and I just wanted to add an extra little emphasis on. Kurt's been a great part of something, an institute at the policy school called the Davenport Institute for Public Engagement. We do a lot of training of local government officials around public process and how to improve it, as well as consulting on those. Robert Jordan, who was around here somewhere, is the assistant director. And so if you have any questions about the work that we do, all focused at the local government level, obviously that's going to be a major part of the rebuilding process as well, is how do we best engage residents in making decisions where public policy is change and people don't like change. But if they have a chance to actually feed into it, you have a better chance of having those decisions be more sustainable. So again, please thank the panel. We're going to take a 10-minute break.